violent. That's what they always call us. Us, those not in power. That is what the people in power call those. That's what they call us, the people. They call us violent. We're trying to protect ourselves. And they don't admit how they themselves are violent. They're violent across the entire planet. Violent everywhere. They stick their hands in every single pie. And we need to start to speak that same language. A lot of what I'll be saying will kind of be with my own interpretations of what I've learned from Malcolm X and a little bit of Fred Hampton as well. Like the Black Panther Party. We need to speak their same language. If a man speaks in Russian, you can't speak to him in Ukrainian. If a man speaks English, you can't speak Chinese to him. You need to speak a language they understand. They only understand one language. Like the Klan, white supremacists, the Proud Boys, they only understand one language. And that's violence. You have to speak the same language they understand so that there can be a dialogue, so that things can actually change. Because once you actually speak the same language, there can be some communication. There can be, once again, some dialogue. But they spin us protecting ourselves into violence. They spin it into people advocating for violence, period. They said the Black Panthers were for violence, period. They said that Malcolm X was for violence, period, against anyone who's white. If you see a white person, you should kill him. No, that's not what they're talking about at all. If you actually listen to what any of them have said, that's going to be farther from the truth. Especially with Malcolm in the case of his later years. In the early parts, he was racist. He was a segregationist. But after he left the Black Monster movement and Elijah Muhammad, became much more, say, progressive. Hampton, as always, and the Panther Party, they were about protecting themselves. They would roam the streets of California with guns, patrolling, so that the police wouldn't kill them until, Reagan banned open carry, all for our rights of guns. Oh, unless it's black people using them, They're violent with a reason. Like, if you get attacked, shouldn't you be allowed to protect yourself? It's like standing ground. Your house is your castle. I mean, if someone tries to kill you, you should be allowed to protect yourself. Should you not? It's not even just life or death. Think about like protests. BLM and civil rights protests. They've spun BLM protests to be violent. But if you look at the statistics, they're not. They are less violent than civil rights protests. You wouldn't say that civil rights protests were violent? During the times, yes, they were. They were shown as being violent. That's what the general public believed. There's even an image I found where it's Martin Luther King Jr. in front of like destroyed city, and it's him saying, "I plan to lead another non-violent march tomorrow." I'll put the image up right here. Isn't that so interesting? How the dog whistles and the dogma hasn't changed in 6 decades. It's the same game all across the world, all across time. It's the same shit. And Trump, he does the same thing though. And I quote, "They're not peaceful protesters, as Sleepy Joe and the Democrats call them. They are thugs. It is all taking place in Democrat-run cities. Call me and request federal help. It will solve your problems in a matter of minutes. Thanks to the U.S. Marshals in Portland!" Exclamation point. That was said by Trump on September 8th, 2020. While he was still president. This thug narrative has been peddled for so long, not just the violent one, but the thug one. Super predators. These people aren't humans. They shouldn't be treated the same way. They say that you can't speak their language because all they speak is violence. When we're just trying to speak the same language as you. I mean, if you look at the action of the United States, they are about violence. They're violent everywhere. They're violent in the Middle East. They're violent in Iraq, Afghanistan. They're violent in Africa, North and the rest of it. They're violent in South America, like Venezuela. They're violent in Russia. They're violent in Korea. They're violent all across the entire planet. Yet when it comes to protecting oneself in our own homes, especially in our own homes, are they violent? When it comes to protecting ourselves, we must be non-violent. The same things like with the 60s. They had to be peaceful when protecting themselves against lynching. Now we have to be peaceful when protecting ourselves against against police brutality. You have to stay peaceful. You can't protect yourself, no. And then you're a thug. They spin the narratives. They use their press very carefully, very intelligently. They make the victim look like the agitator, make the agitator look like the victim. And they also tell us, like in schools, that the peace is the only way forward. It's the only thing that causes change. Yet we've enacted a lot of change through violence. Think of the Civil War. Think of the Haitian War. The Haitians, they're the first ones to actually abolish slavery. The U.S. didn't do it until, let me think, over a century later? Almost a century and a half later? How peaceful do you think that was? The British Revolution? Is that peaceful now? It makes us also too scared to help if we're just shackled by this nonviolence. Or have police crowding around one black person, putting their knees on his neck, him screaming, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And everyone is just too scared to help. They just have their phones out recording the whole thing. They're not actually doing anything to help him. They're not fighting back. They're not doing anything that could save his life. They're allowed to use violence, but we are not. And let me just leave you all with one final little tidbit, one little nugget of this thing for you all to think about. They can spin Martin and BLM to be violent. Like, you can look at the statistics. I'll link the statistics as well in the description. If you look at the statistics, the BLM protests, the civil rights protests, well, we know that the civil rights protests weren't violent. They're famously nonviolent. And the BLM protests are even less violent. So that being in mind, for those both being nonviolent and then both being spun into riots that destroyed cities or whatever, why don't we then look more critically at Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, and Black Panthers? If we're all told by the same source that these all are violent, and we know for a fact that half of them weren't violent, shouldn't we probably re-examine them? Shouldn't we probably re-examine them and really look critically, really think by ourselves? Were they really violent? Or were they just protecting themselves?